Well, welcome to Thinking Christian about faith and culture and life. I'm Grady King, Director of Church Resources at OC, as well as co-leader of Hope Network. Our guest today is Dr. Jim Baird, who directs the honors program at Oklahoma Christian, as well as teaches Bible and philosophy. And today's topic, Jim, is pretty provocative: fear and loathing of science, a Christian response. So welcome. We're glad you're here today. Thank you for being here.
It's good to be here. Thank you so much for asking me, Grady.
It is provocative, that title. I know you gave it and wanted it that way. So thank you for making it provocative and timely, giving out everything we're experiencing with COVID. And honestly, when it comes to science and what we're hearing, I don't know sometimes what to believe or who to trust. And I guess my assumption is I'm not the only one that has maybe at times some suspicion about science. Why are people so suspicious about science?
Well, that is a really good question. I don't think anybody knows the full answer to that. I think overall, people love science. It's interesting. It doesn't really matter if you're religious or non-religious, if you're on the left of the spectrum politically or on the right of the spectrum politically. Everybody seems to want to get science on their side. They want to claim, science tells us that, and whatever their position is. Religious people want to do that. Left and right politically want to do that. So science has a lot of prestige. And yet, when claims are made, especially claims that aren't, convenient for us or don't line up exactly with what we believe, we have a lot of suspicion as well. I'm not sure all the reasons that's true. I think I probably would put this out. I think there is kind of, because science has been so successful, I think non-scientists may have a bit of a overestimation of how good science is at what it does and how it works, really. So I would probably put this out, especially to all of us who are non-scientists, Grady. Science operates by getting it wrong before it gets it right.
Wow.
And that's built into the scientific method. You get stuff wrong in order to make the progress necessary to get stuff right. That happens over and over again.
So that kind of sets up this possibility that science can be misused if they're anywhere along that continuum of getting it wrong before they get it right.
Oh yeah, that's exactly right. And of course, science has been misused. I want to say something about that in a second. But science puts out these hypotheses based on what we think is right now, and then goes and tests that. And that's how you make progress. Probably the most famous example of that, I have to tell you this example because I love it, is Columbus. Columbus was dead wrong about the shape of the earth. And I love this story because when I was a kid, I was taught that Columbus was the only one who was right about the shape of the earth.
Huh.
And all of the church leaders and all of the scholars were wrong. And Columbus was this brave individual who knew, the real shape of the earth.
Yep, that's what I was taught.
Were you taught that too?
Yeah, I was taught that too.
You're old, because that's definitely a generational thing.
Well, we're exactly the same age, so I mean, what can I say?
Yeah, I know. We're both old. The myth of Columbus was that everybody thought the earth was flat, and he was the only one that thought the earth was round. And he knew, you could sail west and you wouldn't fall off the edge. And that was just made up by kind of anti-religious writers in the 1800s. Washington Irving, but it's picked up by scholars who should have known better. And it's been used really badly, even into the 20th century, where people really should have known better. Columbus was just wrong. He thought the earth was about a third smaller around in diameter than it really is. And almost everybody disagreed with him. People had a pretty good estimate of the diameter of the earth for years, for centuries, really, since well before the time of Christ. But he thought, I can load enough water and food. I can sail straight west to China and open a new trade route. if there hadn't been North and South America in the way, he and his men would have all starved or, died of dehydration. So he just got really, really lucky. That's a good illustration. Science gets stuff wrong. It's a really important discovery. We were lucky that he was willing to go do that. Science can get stuff wrong in order to get stuff right. And the reason I want to stress that is I've noticed during the COVID times, arguments about masks and arguments about, what the proper precautions are. Sometimes people just get freaked out when scientists come on board and say, well, we've kind of changed our estimate here, or we think actually this treatment is better now, or this group of scientists at the CDC disagrees a little bit with this group of scientists at the WHO, and people say, it's evidence of a vast, left wing, right wing, middle wing, I don't know, conspiracy or something. And no, it's just kind of the way science works. Okay, that's what I wanted to say about that one.
So that's under that heading of misuse, of how it's misused. Yeah.
Well, no, I mean, that's just, I think that's why people get a little suspicious of science.
So I do
think another reason people get suspicious is that science does get misused.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. What are some illustrations of that, and in what ways?
Yeah, well, I think overestimation sometimes non-scientists have about how science works is, I think sometimes people think it's just almost a superhuman activity. Because such incredible things have come out of scientific advances, and our lives have been changed and improved so much by science. We almost think that science is this, the rest of us are down here, mere mortals on the surface of the earth, and science is somehow operating at a superhuman level. And the real facts are scientists are human beings, and they are subject to the same kind of sins and temptations as the rest of us. And so people lie sometimes, and people cheat sometimes, and people get politically co-opted sometimes, and religiously co-opted sometimes by both the forces of religion and the forces of anti-religion, for that matter. And whenever that's found out, of course, that makes people a little bit suspicious too, because that does happen. Everybody wants to claim what they're saying is backed by science.
Mm-hmm. So we kind of become, I know there's one author was a Jewish rabbi, and he taught family systems, but he's famous for saying, Dr. Edward Friedman, he's been dead for a number of years.
Yeah.
But he says, we are consumed with being data junkies.
That's good.
We are consumed with data junkies. We think data will actually transform something. And in some cases it does, but we get so data junkie oriented, and so I think sometimes we just get addicted to data, and it creates maybe fear and anxiety, and it's misused in that way.
Yeah. And there are things that science is really good at, and there are things that are really outside the scope of science. And I see people, because science has such high prestige, over and over again, I see people clothing what they're saying as if it is something science is saying that is well grounded in science, when in fact, it's outside the scope of science.
Do you have an illustration of that comes to mind?
Oh, yeah. I've got a lot of those. Whenever you hear someone say something that is a covert comment about morality, saying, well, there's really no scientific evidence about anything having to do with morality. Just take your moral issue. There's no scientific evidence that the embryo is human, for instance.
Right.
That's a technically correct statement, because a human is not a scientific category. That's a value that we place on ourselves. Mm-hmm. And science doesn't deal with values. And so that's technically correct, and it couldn't matter less.
Oh, that's interesting. Couldn't matter
Yeah,
less.
yeah, because it's out. Values have kind of been systematically placed outside the scope of science. It's
Hmm.
kind of the way science has developed.
Hmm. I know some people have kind of turned this COVID time into, all of a sudden they're making the big theological jump that this is God's judgment, that God's trying to say something to us. I, I feel, compelled to ask that. How do you respond to that? Because you know, it the longer we go, the more that's going to start coming out in fundamentalist kind of ways.
Well, that's been said before by Christians, and I kind of grieve about that, especially when it's coupled with people saying, "So we shouldn't do anything about COVID. We should
Oh,
just
right.
let God do what He wants because otherwise we're playing God or we're interfering or whatever."
Mm-hmm.
That's a
Mm-hmm.
particularly pernicious position, and it's a very anti-Christian position to take.
Ah,
And that's been taken before, and it's usually just, well, I don't know all the motives of people, but sometimes it's used just to cover up. I don't want to mess with this, or I don't want to change my behavior. So um, I'm going to say it's God's will and let it go at that.
oh yeah, the God's will card. That's a big card that people play. I remember in the '80s when AIDS was coming about.
There you go.
I was a young preacher then. You were too, and all of a sudden it's like you're hearing this stuff. AIDS is the plague of God, and I'm going, wait just a minute. That could do it does some untold damage to people's faith
Yeah.
in this God that we read about in Scripture. So, what do
Yeah.
you wish people then better understood about science?
Well, this is a subject I teach. I teach it for graduate students. I teach it for undergraduate students. This is something I research academically. And I really, really wish more people understood that modern science has evolved to have a fairly limited scope at what it's good at.
Hmm.
And a lot of the errors about science come from people loving the success of science, but not realizing that the success of science comes from the fact that it's evolved to focus very well on a limited set of problems, on a limited scope of problems. And I wish people understood that more. Science, as we practice it today, has focused almost entirely on that which is physically measurable and mathematically predictable.
Oh, I like that. Physically measurable and
Yeah.
mathematically predictable.
That's kind of, and science has changed over the centuries and so forth. But the way we do it today, it focuses on what is physically measurable and mathematically predictable, and it really gives science incredible power in that limited range. But it leaves out a bunch of stuff that we should, if we were wise consumers of science, we would say, yeah, but I can't expect science to now answer other questions, like questions of moral value and so forth. A lot of other questions too.
Yeah, and even
So
yeah,
go ahead.
theological and philosophical things. I'm thinking that can easily attitude can be easily translated over to Scripture itself. I mean, how we approach Scripture.
Sure,
Yeah.
sure. I think it can. Just almost anything. I mean, think about almost everybody knows Beethoven's Fifth Symphony,
Right.
and the opening chords of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. And, um, that's an incredible piece of music. It's survived for centuries now. It's a classic in every sense of the word because it is so powerful in its effect on us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What's the physically measurable part of that?
Hmm.
Well, the physically measurable part of that, what science can deal with about that, It can measure air pressure waves. What's the frequency of the air pressure wave? That's the science of acoustics. What's the amplitude of the air pressure wave? And that's by focusing on the frequency and amplitude of air pressure waves, you can figure out how to construct an auditorium and how to amplify and focus the sound and give the listener the best possible auditory experience. That's an incredibly powerful way to deal with it. But all of us know that does not really get at what's going on when I'm sitting and listening to a really top-notch orchestra perform Beethoven's Fifth.
Right.
So there's a ton that's just left out. Everything that happens in my emotions, making me feel things, making me want things, making me, want to be a better person. All of that stuff, that's beyond the scope of what science can measure. It could even put me in a CAT scan and see, oh, look, his brain is lighting up this way or that way, but it still can't get at, it's not physically measurable, all the stuff that's happening that really is what we care about in our experience of something like that.
This is really helpful to me because I think if, it's kind of like the pyramids being inverted here.
Yeah.
And here's what I mean by that is that the assumption was that the longer we live and the more intelligent we become and the more discoveries we have, that now the science gets broadened and
Yes.
you're saying it gets specialized. So it's like an inverted pyramid.
Right.
I mean, I don't know. That's not the assumption I think people in our current day are living by. And so this is a very important discussion and may answer why Christians are even hostile toward it in some ways.
I think it's deeply connected to that. I really do. I think we're kind of in two minds here, and that is really a significant thing. There is kind of coming out of the secularization process of the Enlightenment, where we kind of need a counterpoint to religion.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of weight was put on, well, science can answer the questions we used to ask religion to answer for us. What kind of people should we be, and how should we organize society, and what should government look like, and all of that. Science will do that for us. And so we put a lot of weight on science to answer all questions. But at the same time, the science we were evolving during that period got narrower and narrower and narrower. No, we're only going to focus on the physical because it doesn't work to focus on all this other value stuff that Aristotle used to focus on. We're only going to look at the physically measurable. And so we hollowed out all the values that we need. So we have people who say, well, somehow, some way, science must answer these questions. But the actual science we practice doesn't have a way to answer all those questions. So You're exactly right. It leaves us in a serious quandary. We keep saying, well, we got to be scientific, but science is just not, the way we practice is not built to answer questions about value. It's way not built to answer questions about God. Just cannot. God, of all the things that are outside the scope of science, God is way outside the scope of science.
So this kind of helps put in frame of reference those who believe in the 24-hour day versus not the 24-hour day, all the creation science, all the stuff attached to that. I have relatives that believe if you don't believe that God created the earth in 24 hours, you can just read the text and see that's what happened, then you're not a really dedicated Christian. You're off base. And I'm going, wait just a minute. That's not the intention of Genesis in the first place. Well, how do you know the intention of Genesis? And it creates all kinds of arguments, and that really is not necessary when you have this framework you're talking about.
Yeah. Well, I think that's true. That's a whole other thing. You got to give me at least 2 hours, Grady, to talk about that issue, not 30 minutes. But I do think that comes out of this transition, arising from, well, we're going to put more and more weight on what we're calling science and less weight for society on religion. We're going to secularize our society. And I think the reaction in America, at least, the reaction to that took the form of a real grasping of the young earth reading of Genesis. And, biblical scholars before the 20th century were never 100% young earth. And biblical scholars today say that's not what the text requires. It's one possible reading, but it's certainly not the only reading. But kind of socially, it's sort of like, well, yeah, but to fight against this secularization, I got to hang on to, a young earth reading. And that's the only one I'm going to allow for social reasons, not because that's what the text requires.
It becomes
that's kind of my interpretation of what I think is going on there.
Yeah, you're right. We need another whole session on that. It becomes, we need something to, when we feel so disoriented, we always want something to orient us. So we're going to latch on to something. And some latch on to science 80% and religion 20, and some latch on to religion 80% and science 20. So, but in general, has there been a hostile attitude towards science from the Christian community in general?
Historically, no. But right now, there is a lot.
Yes.
Historically, not at all. I mean, the way we practice science now, the science that comes out of the Enlightenment, so modern science, is by and large the invention of Christians. It comes out of Christian Europe, and not just nominal Christians. Some of the biggest names that you can think of in the creation of modern science are very dedicated Christians. Isaac Newton wrote more about theology than he ever wrote about physics.
Wow.
Galileo, though we think of him as having a big fight with the church, which he did, he gives every evidence, the more we know about him, of being a dedicated Catholic. And one of the few things he refused to sign that the Inquisition wanted him to sign was that he had been an unfaithful son of the church. Johannes Kepler, incredibly dedicated, fervent Christian. Robert Boyle, one of the other, four horsemen of the new science, very dedicated Christian. You have to go a long way. It's not until like somebody like Haley you get to somebody who's truly an atheist among the early scientists.
That's interesting.
Yeah, but today I think we do have that attitude. And I think some of that has to do with a real propagandistic turn that takes place in the 1800s, in which people like Thomas Huxley and Herbert Spencer and a bunch of other folks really thought science, especially Darwin's science, was a stick they could use to further this, what I was talking about earlier, that secularizing agenda. We got to take power away from the established churches, the Catholic Church, the Church of England, the Protestant churches of Europe, and we got to, disestablish their power and replace those with non-religious institutions. De-religicize or secularize the universities and the schools and the courts and the government, and science is our stick, to make that happen.
Wow.
Well, so, and Christians, reacted negatively to that, and some had very strong reactions to it, and some had medium reactions to it. And so I think our current thought that, you got to choose. You can't believe in science and faith. I think that's kind of an outgrowth of those developments from the 19th century. And I'm going to tell you something. If you tell me, and if it were true that I had to choose between faith and science, I would totally choose faith. And that would be the rational thing to do.
That's interesting that you're emphatic about that.
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, that would be true no matter what your faith is, actually, because faith is always underneath the rest of our rationality, whatever your faith is. You can be a Muslim, a Buddhist, a Christian. Your faith is always the bedrock of the rest of your reasoning ability. Again, you're going to have to give me 2 hours on that one. But so that's the rational thing to do.
Sure.
But I'm saying in this case, you don't choose between faith and science. Right. That's never an actual real choice. Science is not the kind of thing that can stand on its own well enough to be a rival to faith.
Well, that kind of leads us into this question of some people say science proves God, and others say science disproves God, and you're kind of given a framework for processing that question. Who's right? Yes, no, maybe.
Okay. There is no scientific proof for God, and it couldn't matter less.
Wow, that's huge.
Because
That's really huge.
God is way outside the scope of science.
True, true.
You know, God is not the kind of thing that science is set up to investigate. And there's so many reasons why that's true. We could talk and talk and talk about why that's true. Let me just give you one that's been used by many, many people over the years. When you do science, you got to have your experimental group and you got to have your control group, right? So think about doing that with God. You know?
Yeah,
okay. Well, this is how things look when God's around, and this is how things look when God isn't around. So point me to the part of the universe you're going to use to say, okay, this is the part where God isn't. We've got no control group. We've got no way to do that experiment. We don't know what the universe looks like where God isn't, because he is everywhere. He's always and always has been. There are a whole bunch of other reasons why this is outside the scope of science. Our ability to do science is dependent on there being a God, being a rational universe, and so forth. So God, there isn't such a thing as, strictly speaking, scientific proof of God. Now, I actually think when we move up a level from science, we move, beyond that to human wisdom and human rationality. There are several things in science that the best way to make sense of them, in my opinion, is that there is a God. So science does provide us evidence for God, but it's not a finding of science. You have to go up above the level of where science operates in order to reach those conclusions. I think they're well-justified conclusions. I think they're very powerful conclusions. I just wouldn't call them scientific conclusions. I think they're above the level, and they're outside the scope of what science deals with. God's outside the scope of what science deals with.
Boy, that right there, that little last excursus was very, very helpful in my mind. For a lot of people that will listen to this, to hear this, I think that's a very engaging conversation, a line of thinking. I've always reconciled it that without mystery, there's no faith. That mystery is essential to faith. And, I'm not talking about the mystery of godliness in Timothy. I'm just talking about mystery in general, that mystery is important in my life to just let the mystery be what it is as a part of faith, rather than trying to find my rational arguments. I see it with young people all the time. Well, I just don't see God at work, and I don't see God here, and I don't see God there. And I'm going, mystery is part of faith.
Yeah.
And faith is trust. So
I agree with you. I mean, I think that's true. Mystery is part of the human condition. It's part of the way God built us. And, if you're going to deal with God at all, you're going to deal with mystery. That's as true as anything can be.
You said that.
You can't live a human life without coming to grips with mystery. There's a famous, how are we doing on time, Grady? You better keep me
We got
going.
4 or 5 minutes. We're good. Okay. We're good. And
there's a famous essay from late in the life of Erwin Schrödinger. Schrödinger is this incredible genius who is one of the two big architects of quantum mechanics as people are trying to figure out this kind of strange subatomic world. Erwin Schrödinger is crucial for some of those breakthroughs. And later in his life, he writes this weird essay essentially about the problem I've been talking about. And he says, science is wonderful at what it does. It gives me this beautiful, simple picture of the universe. But he says, the trouble is it's way too simple. It's good precisely because it's cut out everything I care about.
Right.
He says, me as a person, I'm not even in the universe that science describes. The color blue is not in the universe that science describes. What he means is we can measure electromagnetic waves, but we can't actually talk about what it feels to experience blue. You know, Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, the sound waves are in science, but the experience of the symphony is not. You're not. God's clearly not in it. Morality, right and wrong's not in it. Beauty's not in the scientific universe. You know, he goes on and lists all these things. And he says it's powerful because it's been stripped down and focused, right? And that, when I read that, I realized that's what's been bugging me this whole time. Let science be science and stop trying to make it do this other stuff.
Wow, that is really powerful. I wish we had some time. I've got questions about how Paul reasoned with the Epicureans and the Stoics. I have questions about just the way the world that Paul functioned in, the Apostle Paul, and how he used his training and background in dealing with some of the very things we're talking about here today. I mean, some of them have a parallels. But so our last question is this: so what? I mean, people that are listening to this, that are Bible class teachers, they're church leaders, or ministers, or preachers. What does this mean for ministry and for the daily lives of Christians? Let's end there.
Well, you know, the biggest thing I wish that I could get across to ministers and ordinary Christians about science is let science be science. Stop trying to imagine that science is more than it is. It is a wonderful blessing from God that we have science. I don't think science works without God's, support. God gives us a rationally understandable, scientifically understandable universe to work in. But science only can answer a certain set of questions. So let science do that. It's actually earned our respect in the areas where it's good. So we should respect it. We should use it. But we shouldn't expect it to answer questions about morality. It's not very good at answering questions about personality. It's not very good at answering questions. It's no good about answering questions about God.
Human nature. It's not good about
that. It's not very good. It's not going to give us the right answers about the purpose of human life, and that sort of thing. And so we shouldn't try to make it do that.
Just accept the heavens declare the glory of God, okay? Yeah. Well, do you have any authors in particular? There are some people saying, well, give me something to read, an author or a book or something you'd recommend that's accessible for people that teach and lead.
Yeah, I think teachers and leaders. There's a book I make my undergraduates read, and it's accessible adjacent, at least. It's by it's called Modern Physics and Ancient Faith, and it was written by this guy by the name of Stephen Barr, who's an astronomer at the University of Delaware. He's actually a cosmogenesis. He works on, how do you get the cosmos? How does that happen physically?
Wow, that's interesting.
But he's a dedicated Christian, and he does an interesting thing. That book, I really like that book. He basically says, there are 5 things that happen, 5 kind of breakthroughs in the 20th century, each one of which made it more difficult to maintain faith in atheism. Each one of these discoveries in the 20th century really kind of tilted the probability dial in the favor of God. Now, he's like me. He thinks God is too big. It's not in the scope of science to deal with. But he says, as humans, using our wisdom, God-given wisdom, these are all things that kind of, if we were tilted towards atheism, each one of these tends to tilt us back towards belief in God. So I really like him. That's Modern Physics and Ancient Faith by Stephen Barr.
Good.
Now he's He's not a young earth creationist or anything like that, so it's not that kind of book. A little more technical, but one I like, is by Alvin Plantinga, Where the Conflict Really Lies. Plantinga is this epic-making philosopher. He's done breakthrough work in so many fields. He's retired now. And his book, Where the Conflict Really Lies, is his attempt to tackle this and to say, this is where, if there is a conflict between, in this area of science and religion and naturalism and so forth, where is it really? And he doesn't think there's much of a conflict between science and religion. He does actually think there is a conflict between a philosophical position called naturalism,
right,
and the theory of evolution. He says, if you really believe evolution, you're kind of in a quandary to also believe that there's no God and everything happens naturally.
That's interesting. Well, that's helpful, and we'll provide those resources for you, Jim. We've got to have another discussion sometime because there's so many questions I have, and we'll do it. But thanks for participating and thinking Christian about life and faith and culture. And we hope that you'll join us in the future. And you can contact Jim at jim.baird@oc.edu if you have questions or need more resources or thoughts. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. It was a pleasure, Grady. Thank you so much for providing this whole venue.
Okay. Have a good day.
All righty. Bye-bye.